Good evening and welcome. My name is John Coatsworth. I'm the Dean of the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and it's my happy duty to welcome you all this evening to what I think will be quite an interesting event. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Susan Aurelia Gittleson, who is just here in front, for making these events possible. It's her generosity and interest in the SIPA public policy forums that have made this series what it has become, an important event for the series of events for the school. So a round of applause for Susan Gittleson. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I should report to you, since you are all, or most of you, are SIPA graduates, an event which took place this afternoon. At 2 o'clock, in the office of the Provost of Columbia University, Alan Brinkley, the Provost, Nicholas Dirks, the Vice President of Arts and Sciences, and I, along with the Vice President for Finance, whose name is Ann Sullivan, signed the final version of the Memorandum of Understanding that will result in SIPA becoming an autonomous, independent public policy school on July 1st of this year. It's an event that we've been looking forward to for many years. One member of our board said, I thought this was something we ought to have done 46 years ago when I graduated from SIPA. So I couldn't let the occasion pass without letting you know that it has occurred and inviting you all to the Independence Party whenever we get around to scheduling it. So let me introduce to you this evening our speaker, who is Ambassador Donald Blinken. Donald was U.S. Ambassador to Hungary from 1994 to 1998, although there are those that say that Donald and Vera together performed the chores of that office. Donald is a native New Yorker. He graduated from Harvard University, magna cum laude in economics, and co-founded the investment banking venture capital firm of E.M. Warburg Pincus and Company. He was chairman of the Board of Trustees of the State University of New York, president of the Mark Rothko Foundation, president of the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and served on the board of the New York Public Library. If he'd been available, he would have become Dean of SIPA long ago. He is currently co-chair of Columbia University's European Institute and is a member of the advisory board of SIPA, where he has served for a number of years with great distinction, helping more deans than he would care to remember make SIPA the great place that it is today. He also serves on the boards of the New York Philharmonic, the Council of American Ambassadors, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, the Project on Ethnic Relations, the Central European University in Budapest, and he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Blinken resides in New York with his wife Vera, and his son Anthony is the National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. His talk this evening is entitled, The Role of the Ambassador in International Relations. He will speak from his professional experiences and make reference to the book that you see in the back of the room, entitled Vera and the Ambassador, Escape and Return, which he co-authored with his wife Vera Blinken. The book itself, just the photographs in the book are worth the modest price that they're selling. So if you'd like to go back to the back of the room at the end of this event, I'm sure there are plenty of copies available. According to Foreign Affairs, this memoir provides, quote, an illuminating picture of how embassies work to manage demanding and tense negotiations at pivotal points in history. It is also a gripping account of a refugee's escape and an engaging peek at the social and cultural aspects of ambassadorial life. Following Ambassador Blinken's talk and the question and answer session, all of you are invited to the cocktail reception, which, as I see, has already begun. Thank you all for coming. Don Blinken.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a great pleasure for me to be part of the SIPA family for the last 8 or 10 years. I enjoyed it very much. I think SIPA and Columbia are wonderful places, and I don't know what I would have done the last 10 years without them, but it's been a great experience. The lecture this evening is about the role of the ambassador, but as John indicated, and as the title of our book suggests, In our case, at least, it was the role of the ambassador and the ambassador's spouse. So that I'm going to talk about what we did and what we found and how things worked out during the 4 years we were in Hungary together from 1994 to 1998. But before I start, I'm going to ask you all a question because there's a Q&A afterwards. How many of you have been to Hungary? Can I see a show of hands? Very good. Anybody here who's ever worked in the State Department? No.
U.S. Foreign Service Commercial Section of Copenhagen.
No, you worked in the State Department. Okay. Good. Well, those of you who have been to Hungary, I think will understand, very well some of the things that I have to report on because you've seen it, whether you were there before the end of the Soviet domination or afterwards. It leaves a very indelible memory, I think, on all of us who've been to Budapest. The book really tells the story of how we got to Hungary, why we went to Hungary, and I think more interestingly for me at the end, what we did while we were there. But let me start at the very beginning. The reason we went to Hungary is because Vera, who's sitting in the front row here, was born there, got out as a very small child in 1950. Her mother tried all sorts of ways of escaping, but finally, as you'll see in the book, she discovered that being involved with some of the diplomats in Budapest was the answer to her problem. The Hungarians passed a law in 1948 expelling all foreign residents of Budapest. And this made it possible for the Italian ambassador to Budapest to come to Vera's mother and say, look, I know you want to get out of Hungary. Your husband passed away a year or so ago, and I can arrange a marriage for you with an Italian who's going to be expelled. So that plus some help from Vera's aunt in New York made all the difference. There was a marriage. The marriage was annulled once they got out of Hungary, but the Italian gentleman in question behaved very honorably, and they ended up first in Zurich, and then in Italy, and finally in New York. So that the book really starts with Vera's escape from Hungary, which set up a lifelong, I would say, sublimated interest in that country. Vera never wanted to go back to Hungary from 1950 until 1987. We'd been married since 1975, and I never could get her to go back to Budapest. But in 87, we were visiting Ronald and Joe Carroll Lauder, who was then our ambassador to Vienna. And Ronald Lauder said, look, if you come to Vienna, you can come. We'd love to have you as our guest, but there's a price. And the price is you've got to go back to Budapest and see what it's like for the first time in all these many years. So we went to Vienna. He gave us a car and driver. We went to Budapest. We spent 4 or 5 days there. Nothing much happened except Vera spent 4 or 5 days, mostly in tears, visiting some of the old haunts that she remembered as a very small child. But the following year, by a series of coincidences, we met the then American ambassador to Budapest, Mark Palmer. We met him at George Soros's house in Southampton, of all places. And in 1988, on the way back from a trip to Moscow for State University, we stopped off in Budapest again. And this time, something happened to really capture particularly Vera's interest and attention. She saw what was going on with refugees. She saw how terrible the Hungarian diet was at the time, and determined when we got back to New York to try to do something about it. She formed a foundation to work with the Hungarians on nutrition and other problems, underwrote the first Peace Corps conference in Central and Eastern Europe, which took place in Hungary in 1989, and I got the State University of New York, which I was then chairing, to introduce a business program and an English training program at some of the Budapest universities. So we became very much involved, I would say, as civilians in the situation in Hungary. Bill Clinton came along in '92. I worked for him early on. He was elected, as we all know, and then I was asked if I'd like to do something, and I said, yes, I'd like to be ambassador to Hungary, because I thought the two of us could make a real contribution together. Vera, because of her background, her Hungarian language skill. As all of you know, once you reach a certain age, to try to learn Hungarian is almost impossible. And I knew that if I went there on my own, I would never have either the time or the energy to learn that very difficult language. it took a while to persuade the State Department that we were the right persons for the job, because that had always been a professional post, a career diplomat's post. But finally, we managed to win the nomination to go to Hungary, and we went there in the very early part of 1994 and stayed till the beginning of 1998. So the rest of the book is the story of what we found, what some of the problems were with the Hungarians and with our own colleagues, and finally what we accomplished while we were there. Because lots of very, very interesting things went on while we were there, both for the United States and obviously for Hungary. But let me stop it for a moment to answer a question some of you may have, which is the question of whether it's a good idea to have non-career ambassadors. This is a question we're often asked, and I think I just answer it before somebody else asks me again. About 30% of our ambassadors traditionally, since World War II, have been non-career. They've been political appointees. And that figure seems to hold pretty well. Sometimes it's a little less than 30, sometimes a bit more, but that's about the percentage. Is it a good idea? I think so, without trying to pat myself in the back. I think having non-career people do some of the jobs abroad is a very useful, I wouldn't say corrective, but a very useful alternative to having only career diplomats. The non-career diplomat brings certain experiences that the career people, as smart as they are and able as they are, and they're very smart and very able, but they cannot have the experiences one gains in the private sector or in NGOs. They don't have the willingness to be flexible and to try to do things outside the State Department rules and regulations. They will make decisions based on what they think needs to be done right away, rather than worrying about whether that will affect their career status and their next job unfavorably. And sometimes they even have a direct line to the president, or at least the host country thinks they have a direct line to the president, which is just as important because it really doesn't work that way. But in any event, in my experience, meeting most of the non-career people and career people in Europe during our time, I thought that by and large the political appointees held up very well and did a very good job and added certain value to the job of being an American ambassador. Now I'd like to turn to what we found when we arrived in Hungary in April 1994. Hungary, of course, had been under Soviet and communist control for more than 45 years. The wall finally came down in '89, but it took a number of years for the Hungarians to get over the mindset and the trauma that inflicted on them. Soviet troops themselves only left Hungary. The last Soviet soldiers only left Hungary in 1991. So they'd been used to living under the control and under the watchful eye of Soviet soldiers for all of those years. So the big problem, the greatest problem that both Vera and I had, both in terms of running the embassy and in Vera making our residence user-friendly for Hungarians and other visitors, was to persuade the Hungarians that they no longer had to worry about talking to us. They no longer had to ask themselves, what do these Americans really mean? When they say X, do they really mean Y? What is their real hidden motive? It took us about a year to get them to be comfortable in understanding that the advice we were giving them, the things we suggested that they do, were not based on some plot to benefit at their expense, but rather we were trying to be helpful to the Hungarians, trying to get them to understand what it took to be part of Western Europe, Western Europe culture, and Western Europe society, and understand that we were trying to do things in their interest, not only in our interest. In Vera's case, this meant changing the whole atmosphere of the residence, which we found to be acceptable but very, very run down. It had not been a place that people came to voluntarily, because during the communist days, if you were a Hungarian and you were invited to the residence for dinner, and that dinner was only business, it was really never social, you had to report the next day to somebody in one of the ministries. What did they talk about? Who was there? And this was a very unpleasant experience for most Hungarians coming to the residence. They were actually photographed in many cases and threatened with loss of passport if they didn't report the next day or two to their minders in the ministry. So we had to find a way of making clear to them that the residence was a little bit of America overseas, which meant cheering up the place physically, improving the appearance of the residence, trying to put in a cuisine that was not just Hungarian, but also Western or American. And most important, bringing people together who could talk to one another and exchange ideas. Vera and I found that in the early days, we would invite couples to dinner at the residence. They would accept, and only the husband would turn up. And we were concerned that we were doing something wrong. But in fact, this was apparently the tradition. The wives didn't come because they didn't speak English, or they were nervous about appearing at the American residence, or they knew it was just going to be a business meeting, which was very, very boring for them. So it took us a while, with a little help and encouragement from some of our friends in the other embassies, to understand that the fact that the wives did not show up was not our fault, but was rather the culture that we were encountering and trying to change. But after a year, the couples began to come to the residence and enjoy themselves. And Vera was very careful to seat Hungarian-speaking people next to others who spoke Hungarian, so they didn't feel isolated or left out at these dinner parties. In my case, the mindset of the Hungarians, as I mentioned before, was the big problem. It took a while to get the Hungarian government, they were former socialists, really former communists, to understand that the United States really was trying to be helpful, that it was in our interest that they succeeded in becoming members of not only Western Europe, but later on perhaps joining some of the Western Europe institutions that made so much difference. I mean specifically NATO and the European Union. When I arrived, they were already beginning to talk about the European Union in Budapest. NATO was something that also interested them, but the European Union was closer to home. It meant jobs, they thought it meant investment, it meant business. And I had to explain to them that they were not going to get in the European Union right away. This was going to take many years because the Europeans themselves had very, very complicated rules for membership in EU. The EU members themselves often did not agree with one another. And becoming a new member of the EU was going to take time, and the evidence that the Hungarian economy was ready to accept the responsibilities and the challenges. But NATO, I suggested, was a little easier because NATO was largely a defensive alliance. And because the United States was and is the dominant partner in NATO, if the Hungarians shaped up, if they did the things they had to do, we could see to it that NATO membership was not impossible. It could happen in a relatively short period of time, and I'll get to that a little later in my talk. But those are some of the issues that I faced. The other big issue that we found when we arrived was the fact that the Hungarian government was Hungarian economy was going off the rails. We see a replay of that today in Budapest and Central Europe. Many of the same problems that they're facing today, they faced in 1994, 95. Excessive spending on social programs, Social Security, health care, pensions. And they could not afford these things, and yet this was the mindset that they'd been living with for 45 years, and they had not yet experienced capitalism or democracy in any meaningful way, so they were naturally reluctant to let go of these perks. But at the same time, they couldn't afford them. Their national debt was horrendous in 1994. They were running out of money, and it looked like they would be another Mexico, which would have to be bailed out by the international community if they could be bailed out at all. But happily, I was able to communicate with the Prime Minister Horn, and I tried to explain to him that, look, you've got these serious problems. There's no way in which you can pretend they don't exist. You're going to have to bite the bullet and do what you have to do. And that meant cutting back on some of the social programs, raising taxes, limiting consumption of cigarettes and gasoline and all those wonderful things that they were suddenly enjoying. And most importantly, beginning to privatize the Hungarian economy. When I arrived, some 75 or 80% of the Hungarian economy still was owned by the government. When we left at the end of 1997, that figure was down to 20%. But the important thing was the Hungarians understood that by privatizing, by bringing in direct foreign investment, not by just giving out pieces of paper and saying, this is now a private company, but actually inviting foreign investors, foreign companies from all over the world to come in, they would not only receive the capital they required, but equally important, they would get ideas about modern management. And without management, receiving money would not have done them very much good. So we made it clear to them that privatization was the way to go, but they had to use the proceeds from privatization to reduce their foreign debt. not to spend it on social programs or building highways or all the other nice things that they thought about. And they did this. Prime Minister Horn brought in two very able young economists, Lajos Bokros to be the finance minister and George Chiranyi to be the president of the central bank. What's interesting about those two names is that in the last month or two, as the Hungarian government has been struggling to find a successor to Prime Minister Gyurcsány, both Bokros and Chiranyi's names have emerged as the leading candidates for his job. They were very intelligent in the 1990s, and happily they're very smart today. Neither of them accepted the offer. And they've turned the job over the next year to an interim prime minister who doesn't have their international stature, but who I think will be very helpful. But they did the job. Austerity became the norm in 1995-96. And Prime Minister Horn knew, I think, that by implementing these very difficult measures, he would not be reelected in 1998. He would be too unpopular then to win a reelection. And he was right. He was not reelected, but the Hungarian economy pulled itself up by its bootstraps, and foreign investment flooded in because the Hungarians made it clear that they were investor-friendly, and that after a period of time that their tax laws and the regulations, if not beautiful, were at least manageable for major foreign investors. So with the help of some of my colleagues in Washington and the IMF, Hungary finally pulled itself out, and by 1996, end of 96, it was well on the way to the economic prosperity that one sees, or at least one thinks one sees, if one visits Budapest today. The other big issue, of course, was security in Europe and membership in NATO. There was an organization that many of you may remember called the Partnership for Peace, which President Clinton and others had implemented in the early 90s to begin to train former Warsaw Pact countries in what it took to be a NATO member. It wasn't NATO membership, but it was kind of a stepping stone towards it. What do we mean by civilian control of the military? How is this supposed to work? How are countries supposed to relate to one another in terms of defense and security? So the Hungarians were, I would say, avid members of the Partnership for Peace, and were going along quite smoothly as Bosnia appeared on the horizon. And Bosnia, I think, was one of the keys to what we see in Europe today, and the key to Hungarian modernization, Hungarian membership, not only in NATO, but in the European Union. It occurred to a number of us, both here in the States and in Hungary, that the Bosnian situation was untenable. It was a terrible situation for the Bosnian people, but it was also very, very bad for Europe, because how could you have a part of Europe after all these years after World War II and the end of the Cold War that was in conflict, where people were being killed every day? And finally, thanks to some of our good colleagues in Washington, notably Madeleine Albright and Dick Holbrooke, the Clinton administration was persuaded that we had to be engaged in Bosnia. We could not, the United States could not afford to stand on the sidelines. Along came the famous Dayton meetings that you all know about, and the agreements for solving the Bosnian-Serbian problems. And that in turn led to the need for a NATO peacekeeping force going to Bosnia to make sure that this peace that had been drawn up in Dayton, which was very fragile, was maintained. That was the key, as I say, to the opening the door to Hungarian membership in NATO and changing the whole view of NATO on the part of the Western alliance. Here was a country that had been, as I say, involved with Soviet soldiers right up to 1991. It was not anxious to have Soviet troops come to, NATO troops come to Hungary so soon after this happened, and yet the Hungarians sensed that they would have to be, in some way, players in the effort to keep Bosnia under control. Early in November 1995, I received a visit from the then head of the American forces in Germany, General Crouch. He came to see me with about 6 or 7 of his colleagues. We had a very interesting meeting at the embassy, and he spent a lot of time discussing the Bosnian problem. And finally, he got around to the purpose of his visit to me, which was to say, Ambassador, if we want the Hungarians to help us, we think we need to stage our Bosnian campaign in Hungary. It's the best country for setting up a NATO base. Would you be willing to try to help the United States government and NATO get Hungarian permission to do this? And he said, I'd like to come back in a few weeks and get your answer. Since I'd been very much in favor of an American presence in helping stabilize Bosnia, I didn't wait at all. I simply said, General Crouch, just consider it done. And we immediately, my embassy and I immediately began the job of trying to get the job done by making sure that the Hungarian government was fully on board and understood what we needed and how they would play a role. In any event, after about 3 weeks of negotiations, and it's complicated because you're dealing with logistics, with people, with legal systems, we found that ourselves on the morning of November 27th, 1995, with a vote in the Hungarian parliament, a vote that would decide whether or not they would permit the use of NATO forces based in Hungary to enter and leave Bosnia. And I was very proud that day, November 27th, right after Thanksgiving, to send a telegram to the State Department. I'm just going to read you the telegram, it's just a paragraph. It reads as follows. Following consultation with the leaders of the 6 parliamentary parties on the morning of November 27th, the Parliamentary Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee met in an exceptional combined session at noon November 27th. The 2 committees approved the text of a parliamentary resolution authorizing Hungary to provide support to IFOR. IFOR was the name of the task force to go into Bosnia. This resolution was then passed by the entire Parliament on the evening of November 28th by a vote of 312 in favor, 1 against, and 6 abstentions. The resolution provides for the transit and temporary stationing of IFOR forces, not limited to U.S. forces, along with their equipment and supplies, as well as the use of Hungarian airspace. This was the thing we'd been waiting for. Immediately after that, the Hungarian base at Tassar, a former Soviet air base, was identified as the base that we would like to use for the staging area for Bosnia. It's near the Bosnian border. It has a railhead, an air base which should handle large airplanes. And the United States, leading NATO, immediately went to Tassar, began to set up a base there, which they did in remarkable time. And I'll read one more thing, then I'll be finished reading. From December 16th, 1995 to February 14th, 1996, more than 24,000 soldiers, 200,000 tons of cargo, and 12,000 pieces of equipment reached Hungary and subsequently Bosnia in the largest overland deployment since 1945. Military equipment included 101 tanks, 250 support military vehicles, 145 aircraft, and 57 artillery pieces. This was a remarkable achievement on the part of the American military, but it was also a remarkable political achievement for the Hungarians because they did everything possible to make this staging area successful and viable and do it quickly. One of the things that we in the embassy thought was important was to make sure that the Hungarian people themselves were not frightened by this event. They understood that the NATO forces, the IFOR forces coming to Tassar, were not like the Soviet troops. They were not going to be difficult and keep the base locked up and off limits for any Hungarians, and as they leave, steal all of the plumbing equipment as well. Rather, we wanted them to know that this was a base that was in the interest of the Hungarians and all of Europe. So we opened the base up for regular visits by the Hungarian populace, and they came after a while and saw what was actually going on and got guided tours of a NATO base. The bottom line is that in November 1997, the Hungarians had a referendum. They had been invited to join NATO, and because they had agreed themselves some years earlier that if ever invited to join any foreign organization, they would have to have a referendum, they took a vote throughout Hungary. It was very important for the Hungarians, I thought, because this would be the first time in about 400 years where the Hungarians could really make their own destiny and take their own destiny into their own hands. They've been living under Turkish domination, Austro-Hungarian Empire domination, then the Germans, and finally the Soviets. They had never made decisions really for themselves until 1997, But here was a case where they could decide whether or not they, the Hungarian people, wanted to be part of NATO or not be part of NATO. There was a referendum. It was voted overwhelmingly to join NATO, which made me very, very happy. And even more happy was the fact that the Kaposvár County, where Taszár, the military base, is located, had the highest percentage of Hungarians voting for NATO membership of any county in Hungary, which showed that our efforts to try to get them to understand that we were benevolent occupiers had succeeded very, very well. NATO membership was not only a military option for Hungary, but it was also a political option, because I think it's important to understand that NATO, for the new members that came in after 1999, was not only their effort to cooperate militarily, but also to accept NATO standards of how countries are governed and how people deal with one another. You need to have a parliamentary democracy, a free press. You have to agree that civilians control the military, not the other way around. And you have to agree that you're going to settle differences with your neighbors peacefully through dialogue and negotiation, not through force. So that NATO membership was really a good housekeeping seal of approval for countries that had formerly lived a different way. They understood that their membership not only meant an obligation military, but I think even more important, a political obligation to behave like good, civilized Western nations. And I was very pleased that one of the other carrots and straws involving their NATO membership was the fact that they also had to deal with two neighboring countries that you've heard of. One is Romania, and the other is Slovakia. In 1919, the Treaty of Trianon, the Hungarians lost 2/3 of their territory, and equally important, about 2 million ethnic Hungarians became Romanians, and about 500,000 or 600,000 ethnic Hungarians became Slovaks. This had left hard feelings on both sides of these borders, which had moved. The people had not moved, the borders had moved. But that was 1919. And by 1995, 96, I and many others felt, look, Trianon happened a long time ago. Put it behind you, forget about it. It's not going to be reversed. Look forward, don't look backwards. But there was still unhappiness between the ethnic Hungarians in Romania and Slovakia, their host countries, and the Hungarian government themselves. So happily, NATO came along as both a carrot and a stick. The stick was if you don't work out a very, I would say, happy arrangement with the Romanians and the Slovaks, you're not going to join NATO. But if you behave well and do work out some agreements with these two countries, NATO membership is all that much more possible. And after about a year and a half or 2 years of hard negotiations, the Hungarians, the Romanians, the Hungarians, and the Slovaks signed very, very nice treaties, which gives the ethnic minority certain rights in those countries, the rights to use their language, to teach in Hungarian in their schools, to have Hungarian road signs, but also to recognize the fact that they are citizens of Romania and Slovakia, not of Hungary, and they have to behave like Romanian and Hungarian and Slovak citizens. It worked pretty well. There are still occasional blips in the radar screen, but on the whole, I think those relationships have worked well. There are other issues that we faced. Vera found when she was there that women who she invited to the residence frequently for lunches, and who were very accomplished women in all the professions, government, the arts, business, medicine, education, did not know one another. They came to the residence, they sat around looking at one another, wondering, what does the wife of the American ambassador want? And after a while, Vera decided that the only thing to do was to encourage them to meet regularly so that they would share information and talk to one another. I think those of you who know something about the communist days understand that sharing information in a communist society was not a good idea, that information was power. If you kept it to yourself, you were much better off than sharing it with somebody else. So these women, even though they may have been in the same professions, in the same fields, didn't necessarily talk to each other. But after about a year of these lunches that Vera gave for various professions, so you'd have women in education 1 month and women in medicine the next month, they began to exchange ideas and views and see that there was a benefit to getting to know one another. They liked it so much that after 2 years, they decided to formalize these monthly lunches and create an organization which they very, I think, happily called Primavera. And Prima Vera kept meeting while we were there. But as we were leaving, the question was what would happen to it after Vera was gone. I had nothing to do with it. It was entirely Vera's thing, and she did it very well. But would it remain alive or well after we left? And then Vera had I'd say an epiphany. She discovered, among other things, that in looking for a project for Prima Vera after we had gone, that there was no way in which Hungarian women outside of Budapest could get breast cancer screening. They'd have to get a doctor's certificate. They'd have to already have the disease. Then they'd have to go to Budapest. There was no screening availability outside in the countryside. And in a country of 10.25 million people, there were 2 million people in Budapest, but the rest of the population had no access to this. And Vera thought maybe there was some way of getting them to Budapest. But after talking to some of the medical professionals in Hungary, she realized that the right way to go is not to bring the people to Budapest, but to bring the screening to the people. So she and her Prima Vera organization, with the help of a couple of American companies, founded a breast cancer screening program using mobile breast cancer screening vans and trucks. And the first of these, I think, was put into play when, in 1999, going out to the Hungarian countryside, arranging for women to be screened and to see to it that the benefits of modern medicine were available not only in the capital but throughout the country. And by now, I think the number of people screened has been, over 100? 135,000 women have been screened in the 9 to 10 years since that time. The program became so well regarded and so popular that happily the Hungarian government took it over a few years ago, making it part of their medical program and having a large number of these mobile units and a large number of centers throughout the country.
They didn't take it over.
The
health insurance is paying our cost for us to run it.
Good. Still comes out of the taxpayer, right? Okay. So anyway, that's been one of the things that we are very, very proud of. And as a result, a couple of years later, Vera was awarded the Middle Cross of the Republic of Hungary by the president for her contribution to Hungarian healthcare. There were other issues, too, that I think many of you would be interested in, whether it was art restitution, bringing back the Radio for Europe papers from Munich to Budapest, Jewish restitution, which was a particular problem. There were about 20 or 25,000 living survivors of the Holocaust in Budapest while we were there, elderly people, very little money in most cases. The Hungarian government had done nothing about it on the grounds that this had happened before their time, long before their time under the Germans. Why should they have to pay for it? But we were able to persuade them in a series of meetings and I would say lectures that this was something that they were obligated to do, that if they really wanted to set an example for the rest of Europe, they would find some way of compensating these living survivors. And finally, and happily, at the end of 1996, the Hungarian parliament did pass a law providing for a very modest but important compensation for the living survivors of the Holocaust. They got, I think, $50 or $60 a month, but for Budapest, that was a lot of money. It kept the heat on in their apartments, the light on in their homes, and that continues to this day while these people are still alive. So I'm very proud of that, and I'm proud of the fact that we were able to bring the Hungarians back to a central place in Western Europe. Today, the situation in Hungary, as you've read in the papers, is difficult. The prime minister has resigned. There's a temporary prime minister taking office who will, I suppose, operate for about a year before the next election in 2010. There very likely will be a change in government in 2010. The right of center Fidesz party will probably come back and be elected. But at the meantime, the Hungarians are doing what they have to do. They're cutting back, and they're going to cut back very severely in both entitlements. They're going to pay higher taxes at the personal level, and whereas businesses will have their employer taxes cut to try to encourage more employment. The banks have been propped up by a big infusion of capital from the IMF, and I think some of the other things that they have to do, such as you won't believe this, but there's no real estate tax in Hungary to this day, and they're finally going to do something about that. And by 2014, they expect to have a a nationwide real estate tax, which will be very important because it'll be harder to deduct the tax collector if you own property than it is now when you don't report income. So all of these things are happening. Hungary is going to be under duress for the next 12 months or more. A new government will come in, but they will inherit the changes that are taking place now by a caretaker prime minister who is not really political, but rather a technocrat, which was probably a wise move because this will not make any of the socialist leaders toxic in terms of the next election. And by 2010, some of the measures I think will have taken hold. Hungary will take a while to come out of its recession and its credit squeeze. And you must remember, of course, that Hungary as a small country cannot do what we here at home can do, which is to reflate, to manage our own affairs because of the huge size of our country, our populace, and our economy. They're really subject to outside forces to a greater or lesser degree. Their largest trading partner is Germany. They're very dependent on Russia for gas and oil. A lot of their other businesses directed towards Western Europe, Italy, France, and so forth. The United States is a major direct investor in Hungary, but our trade with Hungary, quite understandably, is not that great. So it's good. So basically, in my judgment, the Hungarians are going to need a few years to see themselves righted because they're going to depend on the economies in these big neighboring countries with whom they do business. But as Germany, as the UK, Italy come out of the recession, and as the Russians probably will as well, if demand for energy increases again, I think the Hungarian economy will also come back, and they'll find themselves once more an attractive target for direct Western investment and for tourists and for Hungarian people themselves who are going through this difficult time. Hungarians are still, I would say, a country where part of the population, those over the age of, say, 50 or 60, still think in terms of socialist entitlements, yet wanting to enjoy the benefits of capitalism. The younger people, I think, understand that they can't have these things for nothing. You have to pay for Social Security or education. But they understand as well that this is a very competitive global world, and they're doing a very, very good job in bringing Hungarian business well into the 21st century. So with that relatively optimistic note, I'll end my formal presentation and hope that you have some questions for the two of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay here.
I will.
The floor is open to questions.
Thank you for your very comprehensive presentation. Could you talk also about how you balanced all the responsibilities as an ambassador? In your book, you have a whole section called Getting Things Done, and you were so aware of all your responsibilities. And you also talk about the social and cultural side. But how did you balance it? And particularly since your own background is as an investment banker, how did you facilitate investment by GE and other American companies?
Good, very good question. The answer is not easily. But having said that, let me first say that I found when I arrived a very, very strong team of young people at my embassy, including the Hungarians who work in the embassy. There were about 400 of them in the political section, economic section, AID, commerce, which has played a very important role, and obviously military and security. So I learned from my business experience that there are really no geniuses. There are simply people who recognize the benefit and the talents of other people and call on them when it's appropriate. So I managed to do the things I did by inviting my colleagues in the embassy to take responsibility, to work as a team, and to keep each other informed. One of the things I had learned in my investment banking experience was something very simple. We in my old firm had a quarterly meeting of all the partners where we would sit around a table for 2 days with a piece of paper or two discussing all of the deals that we were thinking about, or the deals we had made, what had happened during the past quarter, what we needed to do in the following quarter to get things done. This was not State Department practice. They'd never done this. And I instituted that kind of a quarterly review in my embassy so that all the members of the embassy team knew what all the other senior officers were up to, what they were about, so that we could work as a team and cooperate. And I think that made a very, very big difference. Right. Well, let me add to that. One of the high points of my 4 years there was opening the first shop serving bagels in all of Hungary in Eastern Europe, and it was called New York Bagel. And Vera and I went to the opening, and she cut the ribbon. But I decided after that it would be a good idea, along the lines of getting the embassy involved, to invite all the embassy staff under the age of 35, the young folks, to sit down with me once a month in a conference room with a sandwich, lunch, and bagels in order to discuss any subject they wanted to talk about, not just what I wanted to talk about. And that also worked very well.
I'm sensing that you must have been very disappointed when your 4 years was up. And I wanted to ask you about the sustainability of some of the programs and actions that you've implemented. I lived in Budapest from 03, 04, and 05, and so I'm familiar with the fact that the ambassador that preceded my arrival, she was very interested in the breast awareness campaign and other things. So a lot of the initiatives were continued, but you were there at a tenuous time politically and economically, and privatization is a one-time deal. It's a one-time pop to the budget, etc. So many things have occurred subsequently. And how did you feel upon your time for departure, and are there some issues that press upon you now?
Well, the first part of your question, how do we feel? I guess it's like, the definition of mixed emotions, watching your mother-in-law drive over a cliff in your new car. And we were sad to go because we felt so involved and so, I would say, pleased with what we were able to do with our Hungarian friends. But at the same time, living abroad for 4 years is a long time. And I think on balance, Vera and I were glad to get back at the end of 1997, even though we knew that there's always unfinished business. You never finish everything you want to do, and the world changes. But I would say it was probably a 70-30 emotion, 70% glad to leave finally, and 30% sorry to leave. What was it? Oh. Well, we watched things going on. I think we've had, by and large, very good ambassadors succeeding us, and most of the programs have continued. Of course, Hungary's changed, the world has changed, NATO has changed, and some of the programs were no longer needed or relevant, particularly on the AID side, but others, I think, are sustained quite well. And certainly, direct investment in Hungary continued up till about a year ago when it suddenly hit a wall. And I think I'm happy with most of the developments there. I have not been too happy, and I can say this personally, I'm not speaking for the U.S. government, with some of the aspects of the right-of-wing, right-of-center party, because I felt that they played the nationalist card a little too strongly in their political campaigning, and even looked the other way when some racist events turned up vis-a-vis the Roma. But having said that, I think by and large, until they allowed their economy to get out of hand again, I think the Hungarians managed very well. Those of you who have been to Budapest the last year or two or three will have seen lots of new buildings, new restaurants, beautiful hotels, too many cars, but they paid a price for that, and the price they're paying now is that their belt tightening is necessary. Vera.
Thank you. I'd like to learn a little bit more about the cultural side of the relationship. You and Vera have done so much for music and culture in the United States, and my understanding of Hungarians is they have an enormous love of music and dance, and I just wonder whether you could reflect on that aspect of the bilateral relationship.
It was one of the most pleasant parts of our relationship, and I won't explain now because it's you might call it cultural, why the Pope and I got involved with Madonna, but if you read the book, you'll find out. But on a more serious cultural level, yes, we went to lots of concerts because they're available, they're very, very good. We became fans of the Budapest Festival Orchestra and tried to be helpful to them. In fact, they even asked me one day to come and give their newly founded board of directors a talk on how American boards of directors for nonprofit organizations function. What is the role of the board of trustees at the New York Philharmonic, for example? And I talked to them for a couple of hours, suggesting that they're going to have to rely on themselves more and more in the future, less and less on the government. But to be more specific, we felt that American culture had to be also shown to its best advantage in Hungary, because there was no reason why the Hungarian people would understand how great our cultural institutions are in this country. And I remember one occasion when the Cleveland Orchestra, which is certainly one of our very, very great orchestras, came to Budapest. Vera and I bought about 30 or 40 tickets, gave them to our diplomatic friends, the ambassadors from the other countries, invited them to the Cleveland Orchestra concert, and had a reception afterwards at the concert hall, because we wanted them to see what a great orchestra, not based in Europe, but based in the United States, really was about.
Mr. Ambassador, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more on structuring privatizations. I don't know how much you got involved, but I was wondering specifically, is there anything the host country has to do to make sure that the privatization is that they get the maximum benefit from the privatization of these?
That's an interesting question, and I'm afraid I know the answer to part of it. Some of it's very technical, but I think from the point of view of the host country, dealing with outside investors, clearly the things that are most important are clear and transparent rules, particularly in the areas of taxes and real estate. I think it's important that the American company understands before it goes in what the ground rules are, what the competition is, what kinds of barriers, if any, they're going to face in investing in this strange country with this strange language. I felt while I was there that, at least in the early 90s, American companies were not as savvy as many European companies insofar as they would come to Budapest or come to Prague or come to Warsaw, spend 3 or 4 days and expect to do a deal. The Europeans, I thought, were much more sophisticated. They would put people in these towns or these cities, not expecting them to accomplish anything for a year or two, but letting them get to know the climate, getting to know the middle-level bureaucrats, so that when they were ready to make an investment, they knew how to deal with the Hungarians and the Hungarian government. I think the American companies have learned a lot since then, but for a while in the early days, it was sort of hit and miss, and I felt frustrated that someone would come in expecting to do a great deal and then leave without having accomplished anything, simply because it takes a little while to build up knowledge and trust.
I have a question for Vera.
Here she is.
I didn't want to leave this evening without addressing a question to you, because I found the ambassador's boxing so exciting. I wanted to know how your experience in Hungary impacted on your return to the U.S. in terms of your public and private life.
Well, interesting you should ask that question just today, because I just had a meeting at lunch. I'm on the board of something called the Foundation for Art and Preservation in Embassies. And it addresses also a little bit of the question about culture that Para asked. I have become involved with that organization because what we do is we try to export our culture. And when Donald said about the Cleveland Orchestra, one of the questions that he was asked at a press conference when we just got there, I'll never forget it, was, Mr. Ambassador, why does the United States export culture such as McDonald's? Why not real culture? And it was difficult to make the Hungarians understand that it is not our government that exports our culture. It comes privately mostly. There really isn't enough funding for the government to export our culture. So we try to do it privately. And this organization that I'm involved with sends art to embassies. We just finished the embassy in Berlin, the embassy in Beijing, where anybody who asks for a United States visa to come here or anything, when they go to the embassy, they see our culture. And also, I stay involved with Primavera because the government now is, luckily, funding our program. 70% of it is funding. And because of our program, they have now in the countryside, in those formerly underserved areas, have 44 permanent places for mammograms. So that's how I try to stay involved. Thank you for the question.
Sir. Thank you.
Enjoyed your talk very much. And I just want to tell you a bit of memory lane. I grew up in Budapest, my native city, and I was a university student in the 50s during Stalinist times. And that was a time when there was a total embargo on anything from the West, books, movies, nothing came in. And the only window to the West we had was the embassy. We didn't dare to go in, but the embassy had pictures in the windows of the United States. And there was always a huge crowd there looking at those pictures, because that was the only thing different we had seen there. And that's why I have a very warm feeling about this embassy even today. My parents were very worried that one of the days the secret police would nab me there or catch me there. And as we took the risk, we went there, and one last thing, I always went with a friend of mine who was in the same class in the university, and we were looking at the pictures, and suddenly I look at him and he turned pale, and said, "Oh my God." And he pointed to a man not far from us, and said, "Well, oh my God, indeed, he was our professor of Marxism-Leninism." He was watching the same pictures, and of course, if he would have seen us, he would have been much more afraid than we were. So, just a little.
Which university did you go to? Also, yes. The Economics University, which is a wonderful university in Budapest, has obviously it's totally dedicated to modern economics and to capitalism, has in its lobby still a wonderful over life-size statue of Karl Marx sitting on a chair, which I hope they never get rid of, because it's a wonderful souvenir of a different time and a different mindset.
Ambassador Blinken, one of the things that really struck me during your speech were the summer references you made to "and after about a year." And as a former Peace Corps volunteer, it resonated with me how long it takes when you come to a foreign country and you have these big ideas about all the things you're going to do to make the country better and the lives of the people better, and you hit this brick wall of culture. And it takes, and you exhibited an exemplary amount of integrity and dedication to your own principles and ideals that you came to the country with, to continue Vera giving these dinners for a year before anything even happens. I can only imagine that. I'd love to hear what it was inside the two of you and in your relationship that kept you going during the entire year's span it would take to actually see something happen out of your immense dedication.
You want to answer that? Well, that's very nice of you to suggest that. I just happen to think, and Vera thinks as well, that if you accept an appointment as an ambassador, particularly if you're a political appointee, not a career person, you have an obligation to take it seriously or not take it at all. Too many people over the years have accepted appointments as ambassadors, go abroad for a year or so, then come back and do nothing, but it looks nice in their resume. We didn't feel that way. We felt that we could really make a difference. And making a difference gave us a lot of satisfaction. So that I think Hungary is the right place for us at the right time, which might not have been true of some other country. You know, when you're dealing with a relatively small country like that, an ambassador, particularly the American ambassador, has an enormous amount of influence. I would say immodestly that after the Prime Minister of Hungary, the American ambassador in the 90s was the most important person in that country. Now, that is not true of the American ambassador in Moscow or London or Paris or someplace else. In the late 1990s, Bill Clinton spoke on the phone with Tony Blair one year 55 times. I don't think he would know the name of the Hungarian Prime Minister, much less call him on the telephone. So that I think there's a role for this kind of effort and this kind of dedication, particularly in countries where the ambassador is serious and he and his spouse, or she and her spouse, can really make a difference.
Thank you, Ambassador Blinken, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, John.
A great talk.
I just want to say one more thing. If you turn to page 148 of the book, those of you who buy it or read it, you'll find out who first suggested that Hillary Clinton become Secretary of State.
Thank you, Ambassador Blinken, and you are all invited to the reception that follows, and the book is at the back of the room.